Hi guys, and today we are going to be reading Murder Most Unladylike. Welcome to my new channel, and each video will be a part from this. So you are going to be able to read the whole book in separate different videos. Hope you enjoy. Bye! Follow along the book if you want. Murder Most Unladylike. Being an account of the case of the murder of Miss Bell, an investigation by the Wells and Wong Detective Society. Written by Hazel Wong, Detective Society Secretary, aged 13. Begun Tuesday, 30th of October, 1934. Deep Dean School. The staff, the girls, third formers, first former, second formers, fifth former, big girls and head girl. Part 1. The discovery of the body. This is the first murder that the Wells and Wong Detective Society has ever investigated. So, it's a good thing that Daisy's bought me a new casebook. The last one was finished after we solved the case of Lavinia's missing dye. The solution to that, of course, was that Clementine stole it in revenge for Lavinia punching her in the stomach during the cross, which was Lavinia's revenge for Clementine telling everyone Lavinia came from a broken home. I suspect that the solution to this new case may be more complex. I suppose I ought to give some explanation for ourselves in honour of the new casebook. Daisy Wells is president of the Detective Society, and I, Hazel Wong, am its secretary. Daisy said that makes her Sherlock Holmes and me Watson. This is probably fair. After all, I'm much too short to be the heroine of this story, and whoever's heard of a Chinese Sherlock Holmes? That's why it's so funny that it was me who found Miss Bell's dead body. In fact, I think Daisy is still upset about it, though of course she pretends not to be. You see, Daisy is a heroine-like person, so it should be her that these things happen to. Look at Daisy and you think, you know exactly the sort of person she is. One of those dainty, absolutely English girls with blue eyes and golden hair, and the kind who will gallop across the muddy fields in the rain clutching hockey sticks, and then sit down and eat 10 iced buns at tea. Or I, on the other hand, bulge all over like a bibbard and the Muncholin man. My cheeks are moony round, and my hair and eyes are stubbornly dark brown. I arrived from Hong Kong partway through the second form, and even then, when we were all still shrimps for this new casebook is what we call the little lower form girls. Daisy was already famous throughout Deep Dean School. She rode horses, was part of the lacrosse team, and was a member of the drama society. The big girls took notice of her, and by May, the entire school knew the head girl had called Daisy a good sport. But that is only the outside of Daisy, the jolly good show part that everyone sees. The inside of her is not so jolly good show at all. It took me a while to discover that. Chapter 2. Daisy wants me to explain what happened this term, up to the time I found the body. She says that is what proper detectives do. Add up the evidence first, so I will. She also says that a good secretary should keep her casebook on her at all times, to be ready to write up important events as they happen. It was no good reminding her that I'd do that anyways. The most important thing to happen in those first few weeks of the autumn term was the Detective Society, and it was Daisy who began that. Daisy is all for making up societies for things. Last year, she had the Pacifism Society, dull, and then the Spiritualism Society, less dull. But then Lavinia smashed her mug during a seance. Beanie fainted and Matron banished spiritualism altogether. But that was all last year. We were still shrimps. We can't be messing about with silly things like ghosts now that we are grown-up third formers. That was what Daisy said when she came back at the beginning of this term, having discovered crime. I was glad. Not that I'd ever afraid of ghosts exactly. Everyone knows there aren't any. Even so, there are enough ghost stories going around the school to horrify anybody. The most famous of our ghosts is Verity Abraham, the girl who committed suicide off the gym balcony the term before I arrived at Deep Dean. But there are also ghosts of an ex-mistress who locked herself into one of the music rooms and starved herself to death, and a little first-form shrimp who drowned in the pond. As I said, Daisy decided that this year we were going to be detectives. She arrived at house with her tuck box full of books with sinister shadowy covers and titles like Peril at the End of the House and A Mystery Mile. Matron confiscated them, one by one, but Daisy always managed to find more. We started the Detective Society in the first week of term. The two of us made a deadly secret pact that no one else, not even our dorm mates, Kitty, Beanie and Lavinia, could be told about it. It did make me feel proud, just me and Daisy having a secret. It was awfully fun too, creeping about behind others' backs and pretending to be ordinary when all the time we knew we were detectives on a secret mission to obtain information. Daisy set all our first detective missions. In that first week, we crept into the other third form dorm and read Clementine's secret journal. And then Daisy chose a first former and set us to find out everything we could about her. This, Daisy told me, was practice, just like memorizing the licenses of every motor car we saw. In our second week, there was the case of why King Henry, our name for this year's head girl, Henrietta, thrilling, because she's so remote and regal and has such beautiful chestnut curls. Wasn't it prayers one morning? But it only took a few hours before everyone, not just us, knew that she had been sent a telegram saying her aunt had died suddenly that morning. Poor thing, said Kitty. When we found out, Kitty had the next door bed to Daisy's in our dorm room, and Daisy has designated her a friend of the Detective Society, even though she's still not allowed to know about it. She had smooth, light brown hair and masses of freckles, and she keeps something hidden in the bottom of her tuck box that I thought was first was a torture device, but turns out to be eyelash curlers. She is mad about gossip, as Daisy, though, for less scientific reasons. Poor old King Henry. She hasn't had much luck. She was Verity Abraham's best friend, after all, and you know what happened to Verity. She hasn't been the same since. I don't, said Beanie, who sleeps next to me. Her real name is Rebecca, but we call her Beanie because she's very small and everything frightens her. Lessons frighten her most of all, though. She says that when she looks at a page, all the letters and numbers get up and do a jig until she can't think straight. What did happen to Verity? She killed herself, said Kitty, in annoyance. Jumped off the gym balcony last year. Come on, Beans. Oh, said Beanie. Of course, I always thought she tripped. Sometimes Beanie is quite slow. Something else happened at the beginning of the term that turned out to be very important indeed. The one arrived. You see, at the end of last year, Miss Nelson, the deputy headmistress, and our dull, old music and art mistress retired. We were expecting her to be replaced by someone else quite as uninteresting, but the new music and art master, Mr. Reed, was not uninteresting at all. He was also not old. Mr. Reed had rugged cheekbones and a dashing moustache, and he slicked his hair back with a brilliantine. He looked exactly like a film star, although nobody could agree on which one. Kitty thought Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Clementine thought Clark Gable, but only because Clementine is obsessed with Clark Gable. Really, though, it did not matter. Mr. Reed was a man, and he was not Mr. McLean, our dotty, unwashed old reverend who Kitty calls Mr. McDirty. And so the whole school fell in love with him at once. A deadly serious, half-secret society dedicated to the worship of Mr. Reed was established by Kitty. At its first meeting, he was rechristened The One. We all had to go about making the secret signal at each other, index finger raised, right eye winking, whenever we were in his presence. The One had barely been at Deep Dean for a week, when he caused the biggest shock since Verity last year. You see, before this term, the whole school knew that Mrs. Bell, our science mistress, and Mrs. Parker, our maths mistress, had a secret. They lived together in Mrs. Parker's little flat in town, which had a spare room in it. The spare room was secret. I did not understand when Daisy told me about the spare room. Now we are in third form, though, of course, I see exactly what it must mean. It has to do with Miss Parker's hair cut far too short even to be fashionable, and the way she and Miss Bell used to pass their cigarettes from one to another during bum breaks last year. There were no cigarettes being passed this term, though, because on the first day Miss Bell took one look at the one, fell for him as madly as Kitty did. This was a terrible shock. Miss Bell was not considered a beauty. She was very tucked in and buttoned up, and severe in her white lab coat. She was poor. Miss Bell wore the same 3 threadbare blouses on rotation, cut her own hair, and did secretarial work for Miss Griffin after school hours for extra pay. Everyone rather pitied her, and we assumed the one would too. We were astonished when he did not. Something has clearly happened between them, Clementine told our form at the end of the first week of term. I went to the science lab during bum break and came upon Miss Bell and the one canoodling. It was really shocking. I bet they weren't, really, said Lavinia scornfully. Lavinia is part of our dorm, too. She is a big, heavy girl with a stubborn mop of dark hair, and most of the time is unhappy. They were, said Clementine. I don't know what it looks like. I know what it looks like. I saw my brother doing the same last month. I couldn't stop myself blushing, imagining stiff, well-starched Miss Bell canoodling, whatever that meant, was extraordinarily awkward. Then Miss Parker got to hear about it. Miss Parker is truly ferocious, with chopped short black hair and a furious voice that comes bellowing out of her tiny body like a foghorn. The row was immense. Almost the whole school heard it. And the upshot was that Miss Bell was not allowed to live in their little flat anymore. Then, at the beginning of the second week of term, everything changed. We could barely keep up with it all. Suddenly the one no longer seemed to want to spend time with Miss Bell. Instead, he began to take up with Miss Hopkins. Miss Hopkins is our game mistress. She is round and relentlessly cheerful, unless you happen not to be good at games. And she marches about the school corridors, brandishing a hockey stick with her athletic brown hair always coming down from a fashionable clipped back waves. She is pretty, and I think quite young, so it was not surprising that the one should notice her. It was the only shocking that he should jilt Miss Bell to do it. So now it was the one and Miss Hopkins seen canoodling in the form rooms, and all Miss Bell could do was storm past them whenever she saw them, her lips pursed, her glare freezing. General Deepdene opinion was against Miss Bell. Miss Hopkins was pretty, while Miss Bell was not. Miss Hopkins' father was a very important magistrate in Gloucestershire, while Miss Bell's was nothing important at all. But I could not help being on Miss Bell's side. After all, it was not her fault that the one had jilted her, and she could not help being poor. Now that she could not stay in the flat, of course, she was poorer than ever, and that made me worry. The only thing Miss Bell had to cheer her up was a deputy headmistress job, and even that was not the consolation it should have been. You see, Miss Griffin had to appoint a new deputy, and after a few weeks the rumour went round that Miss Bell was about to be chosen. This ought to have been lucky. Once she was formally appointed, Miss Bell's money worries would vanish for good. But all it really meant was that the mistresses who were not chosen began to despise her. There were 2 others, really, in the running. The first was Miss Tenson, our English mistress. That is her name, really, although she is no relation to the famous one. If you have seen the painting of the Lady of Shalott drooping in her boat, you have seen Miss Tennyson. Her hair is always down her face, and she is a drippy and underdone cake. The second was Miss Lappe, our history and Latin teacher, who is grey and useless and shaped like an overstuffed cushion, but thinks she is Miss Griffin's most trusted adviser. They were both simply fuming about the deputy headmistress job and snubbed Miss Bell in the corridor whenever they saw her. And then the murder happened. Chapter 3. I say that it was me who found the body of Miss Bell, and it was, but I never would have been there at all if it hadn't been for those crime novels of Daisy's. Matron's fondness for confiscation meant that it was no good trying to read them up at the house. So, Daisy took hanging around down at the school in the evenings. She joined the Literature Society, slipped Whose Body between the pages of Paradise Lost, and sat there peacefully reading it, while the others talked. I joined too and sat at the back of the room writing up my Detective Society's case notes. Everyone thought I was writing poetry. It was after Lit Sock on Monday, the 29th of October, that it happened. After school societies end at 5:20, but afterwards Daisy and I hung back in the empty form so that we could finish. The man in the queue. Daisy was absorbed, but I was a bit jumpy with worry that we might be late for dinner up at the house, and thus in concurred the awful wrath of Matron. I looked around for my pullover, and then remembered with annoyance where I had left it. "Bother," I said. "Daisy, my pullover's in the gym. Wait for me. I'll be a minute." Daisy, nose in book, as usual, shrugged vaguely, to show that she'd had heard and continued reading. I looked at my wristwatch again, and saw that it was 5:40. If I ran, I'd have just enough time to getting up to the house from the old wing entrance takes me 7 minutes, and dinner is at 6 o'clock exactly. I pelted along the empty chalk-smelling corridor of the old wing, and then turned right down the high, black and white tiled library corridor, my feet echoing in hush, and my chest heaving. Even after a year at Deepdean, when I run, I still huff and puff in a way that rude Miss Hopkins calls determinedly unladylike. I passed the mistress's common room, the library, Mr. McLean's study, the one's cubby, and the hall, and then turned right again onto the corridor that leads to the gym. There's a school legend that the gym is haunted by the ghost of Verity Abraham. When I first heard it when I was younger, and I believed it, I imagined Verity all bloody with her long hair hanging down the front of her face, wearing her pinafore and tie, holding a lacrosse stick. Even now that I'm older, and not shrimp anymore, just knowing that I'm on my way to the gym gives me the shivers. It does not help that the gym corridor is awful and is packed full of dusty, broken bits of old school furniture that stand up like people in the gloom. That evening all the lights were off, and everything was smudged in murky shades of grey and brown. I ran very fast down the corridor, pushed open the doors to the gym, and galumphed in wheezing. And there on the floor was Miss Bell. Our gym, in case you have not seen it for yourself, is very large, with bars and beams all folded up against the walls, and wide glass windows. There's a terrifyingly high-up viewing balcony on the nearest side, the main door. We are not allowed to go up there alone in case we fall, but since Verity jumped off, no one wants to. A little room under that for us to change and leave kit in, which we call the cupboard. Miss Bell was lying beneath the balcony quite still, with her arms thrown back behind her head and her legs folded under her. In my first moment of shock, it did not occur that she was dead. I thought I was about to get an awful ticking off for being somewhere I oughtn't, and nearly ran away before she caught the sight of me. But then I wondered, what was Miss Bell doing lying there like that? I ran forward and knelt down beside her. I hesitated before touching her, because I had never touched a mistress before, but in the event it only felt like touching a human being. I patted the shoulder of her white lab coat, hoping most awfully that she would open her eyes and sit up and scold me for being in the gym after hours. But instead, my patting made Miss Bell's head loll away from me. Her glasses stood down the side of her nose, and I saw what I had thought was only a shadow behind her was actually a dark stain the size of my handkerchief. Some of the stain had spread up to her collar of her lab coat, and that part of it was red. I put out a finger and touched the stain. My finger came away covered in blood. I scrambled backwards, scrubbing my hand against my skirt in horror. It left a long dark smear, and I looked at that, and then at Miss Bell, who had still not moved, and felt sick as anything. I had never seen a dead body up close before, but I was quite certain now that Miss Bell was dead. I ought to do it in the circumstances was scream, I thought, but everything was so dark and quiet around me that I couldn't. I truly wanted to do was tear off my skirt and just get the blood away from me, but my Deepdean training rose up inside me, making the thought of running about the school half naked somehow far worse than being alone with the corpse. As I thought this, I realised that Miss Bell really was dead, and I was alone with her body. I suddenly remembered the Gust of Verity Abraham, and thought that perhaps it was her who had killed Miss Bell, pushing her off from exactly the same spot she had jumped from a year ago. And now she might be waiting to do the same to me. It was silly and childish, but all the hairs prickled up on the back of my neck, and deep Dean training or no, I jumped to my feet and ran out of the gym as fast as I could, as if Miss Bell was going to leap up and run after me. Chapter 4. I was in such a tearing hurry that as I ran back along the corridor, I crashed into several abandoned chairs and scraped my knee quite badly. But I hardly noticed until later. My footsteps were echoing all around me, and dark, odd-shaped shadows rose up at the edges of my vision. My breath caught in my throat. I ran all the way back along the library corridor to the old wing, and found Daisy at last, coming out of the form room where I'd left her. I must have looked at a horrible sight, all pink and damp and heaving. Daisy blinked at me curiously. "Whatever's up with you? You're bleeding. We're going to be late for dinner." Beode's raging about it. I looked down at myself in a surprise, and only then I saw that I had blood running down my leg from a long cut on my knee. I could not feel it at all. It was as though it had happened to another person entirely. "Daisy," I gasped. "Miss Bell's dead." Daisy laughed. "Oh, very funny, Hazel," she said. "Imagine." "Daisy," I said, "this is real. She's dead. She's in the gym, just lying there." Daisy stared at me for a moment, one eyebrow raised, and that was exactly when Virginia Overton came storming out of the classroom behind her and discovered us standing there. Virginia Overton is who Daisy meant by VO. She is the Monday night prefect on duty, the big girl who makes sure we all get back up to the house after socks, and she takes her duties very seriously. She pounds about on her fat, flat feet like a policeman and presses her clipboard to her chest like an officer's notebook. "Wells," she snapped, looming out of the form room doorway at us. "Wong, what do you think you're doing? In exactly 8 minutes you'll both be late for dinner." "In the gym, it's Miss, I spluttered. "Hazel thinks someone has hurt themselves in the gym," said Daisy smoothly. "She ran back here to get help." Virginia scowled in annoyance. "Oh, honestly," she said, "you lot do make up a lot of corking fibs sometimes." "You have to come and look," I gasped. "Please." Virginia looked from me to Daisy and then back to me again. "If this is one of your games," she warned. I dragged her back to the gym with Daisy, following. The English mistress, Miss Tennyson, was standing outside Mr. McLean's study at the end of the corridor, talking to a sharp-faced, red-haired mademoiselle. The French mistress. I don't know how Miss Tennyson can understand her. Mademoiselle has a dreadfully strong French accent. Her lessons are a terrible struggle. And grubby old Mr. McLean himself. All three turned and watched as we went by. In fact, we were making so much noise that the one stuck his head out of his little cubby to see what the fuss was. The one had his own little office room at the end of the hall of the library corridor, just next to Mr. McLean's study. He can't use the mistress's common room at the other end, of course, because he's a man. "Problem, Virginia?" Mr. McLean called as Virginia snapped. "I doubt it, sir." As Virginia and Daisy walked through the gym door, I stopped and clicked the main light switch on triumphantly. "There she is," I said, pointing. "I told you." But then I looked down the line of my arm to the place where a few minutes before, Miss Bell had been lying. Miss Bell was gone. The gym was quite empty and still. There was only a little dark smear of the polished wooden floor to show where her head had been. I was still gasping from the shock of it when Virginia spoke. "Good heavens, what a surprise. There's no one here. That will be no dinner for either of you tonight. You for lying and you for encouraging her." "But she was here," I cried. "Honest she was. Look," I said, pointing to the dark smear. "That's blood." Somebody must have come back to wipe it. Somebody must have to come back and wipe it up, and Virginia snorted. "And I'm the Emperor of Japan," she said in a superior tone of voice. They did no such thing, because there never was anybody. As you well know. As for the blood, well, your knee is bleeding. I suppose you thought I wouldn't notice. You've got it on your skirt as well. This is quite one of the most elaborate pieces of nonsense I've ever come across. You really ought to be ashamed. But then, where you come from, I don't suppose they teach you what is wrong to lie, do they? I bite my lip and wished as hard as I could that I had found Virginia Overton lying on the gym floor. Now come along to the house, both of you. I hope Matron gives you a frightful rollicking for this later. That's all I can say. And with that, she seized us by the arm and frog marched us down out of the gym, muttering about useless third formers. I was scarlet with rage and shame. I really had seen Miss Bell lying there. I knew it, but there was no evidence to show that I hadn't made it all up. Virginia walked us back past Mademoiselle, Miss Tennyson, and Mr. McLean. Mademoiselle chuckled and said, "False alarm?" "Very," Virginia told her, and kept on walking. I wondered for a bit if I were mad. This sort of thing simply did not happen outside of Daisy's books. It was ridiculous. But then as Virginia rushed out through the bright lights and wood panelling of the old wing entrance, I happened to glance down at my skirt and saw the dark stain streaked across it. I opened my palm of my hand towards me and saw my index finger still had a faint tide mark of red around its tip. I closed my hand up again into a tight ball, and I knew I was not mad in the slightest. Chapter 5. Even at the furious pace Virginia was pulling us up the hill, we still had not quite reached the house when the dinner gong sounded. I flinched automatically when I heard it in the distance, which was my deep teen training coming out again. One of the first things you learn at deep teen is that bells are sacred. Our lives are parcelled up into the spaces between one and the next, and to ignore the summons is simply criminal. The most important bell of all is the house dinner gong. If you hear it and do not respond to it, or worse, if you are not there to hear it at all, well, there will be no dinner for you. I knew, of course, that we were in much greater trouble than simply missing the dinner gong, but all the same I couldn't help reacting to it. People were still filing in as we came through the main house doors into the peeling old front hallway. But wait there, snapped Virginia, and we were forced to loiter nervously beneath the big hallway clock, which informed us that we were a whole 4 minutes late, as she went storming upstairs to fetch Matron. Matron did not look very happy to hear what Virginia had to say. Her mean, piggy eyes glared at us from beneath her regulation cap, and she breathed heavily through her nose. When Virginia had finished, there was a lull. I could hear the babble from the dining room through the closed swing doors. Then Matron came steaming up to us, whacked us both around the head. Me harder than Daisy, because after all, she had only abetted my lies, and sent us up to our dorm room without dinner to think about what we had done. As we trailed up the scuffed blue carpet of the front stairs, I saw Matron going in to dinner with Virginia by her side. They were muttering together and giving us dark backwards looks so we would know how out of favour we were. I was feeling horribly depressed and not being believed. As well as that, thinking about what I had seen in the gym gave me a nasty taste in my mouth, like the beginning of sick. Daisy, though, was in very good spirits. As soon as the dorm doors swung closed and we were properly alone, she sat down on her bed with a bounce and a crunch. Our beds are not supposed to be comfortable, and said, "Explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said, sitting down next to her and feeling sicker than ever. "I saw Miss Bell lying in the gym. She must have fallen from the balcony. She was absolutely stone cold dead. I didn't make it up." "Well, I know you didn't," said Daisy, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to come across. the corpses of the science mistress in the deserted gymnasiums. You'd never tell a lie like that. Perhaps Lavinia, but not you. You are. Are you sure? She really was dead, though. At that, I sat up indignantly, but then I remembered the way Miss Bell's head had lowered and felt sick again. I touched her, and she was still warm, but dead as anything, I say. She flopped. I told you. She must have fallen off the balcony. Daisy sniffed. Fallen? What do you mean? I asked. My skin crawled. I'd been so busy being horrified about the fact that Miss Bell was dead that I had not thought properly about how it might have happened. It's quite obvious, said Daisy. No one falls to their death and then gets up and tidies themselves away, do they? When you first found the body, it could have just been an accident. But when we came racing back not 5 minutes later to find nobody at all, where one used to be, well, someone must have pushed her, then got rid of the evidence. I gulped. Do you mean she's been murdered? Yes, said Daisy. Don't tell me you didn't think of that before. Oh, Hazel, how exciting. A real murder at Deepdean. Of course, there's always the chance I'm quite wrong. Perhaps you just came in at just the wrong moment and misunderstood things. I did not, I said, annoyed again. Or we simply missed the rescue party somehow. Well, if it is that, and how I hope it isn't, we'll know as soon as we get in tomorrow morning. It'll be all over the school like the mumps. But if it isn't, I asked Daisy, although I really knew the answer. If it isn't, said Daisy, bouncing on her bed again and beaming at me, then our detective society has found our best case yet. We heard the dining room doors bang open downstairs. There was a gathering roar and a clatter of feet up the bare sides of the stairs, and 30 seconds later Kitty threw open the dorm doors and came rushing in, Beanie and Lavinia at her heels. What happened? Why weren't you at dinner? Gasped Beanie. I saved you my pudding in case you haven't eaten. It's a bakewell tart, so it's easy to carry, and you know I hate it. I knew that was a lie and felt guilty, but before I could argue, Daisy had graciously taken the crumbling slice of tart from Beanie and was breaking it in half. It had been entirely wrapped in Beanie's handkerchief, so it was not entirely clean, but my stomach was rumbling. It tasted heavenly. What happened? Asked Kitty while we were eating. What did you do? I must say, Machen and Vio were both looking fearfully enraged about something. No change from the usual, then, said Daisy, through a mouthful of tart. It was nothing, really. Hazel went back to the gym to get a pullover, and Vio caught her in there and decided she was loitering, where she oughtn't. She got into awful trouble with her. Everyone nodded knowingly. Virginia Overton's rages were legendary. To divert attention away from the gym, and in thanks for Beanie's offering, Daisy dug into the contents of her tuck box and came up with a bar of Fry's chocolate. We were all sitting on our beds munching it when the bell for homework, which we call prep, rang loudly. That evening, even though I had masses of prep, I couldn't settle down to it at all. I kept on thinking about Miss Bell and how Daisy and I now knew she had been murdered. For all Daisy's talk, the Wellsmore Detective Society had never really detected anything more important than a very minor theft. But what if we managed to solve this case? We would be the heroine. Miss Griffin might give us medals, and the mistresses, the masters, and the big girls would all line up to clap on us on the back. All, of course, apart from the murderer. That thought brought me back down to earth with a thump. I put my pen and I put down my pen, and King Henry, who was taking prep that evening, said, "Come on, Wong, buck up." Murders, unfortunately, always come with murderers. Attached in Daisy's book, they generally get quite angry about being investigated, and in fact, dreadful things tend to happen to anyone who knows too much about the crime. I had been there, on the spot, straight after the murder had been committed. What if the murderer had seen me? That's the end of part 2 of part 1. The next one they'll come up weekly. I'll aim. The next one will be coming next week. But there will be loads of book videos to come. Just DM me on Instagram. I've put it in my description below. And tell me what you guys want to see on my YouTube channel. But yeah, bye-bye.